I never planned for any of it to happen. That is the one indisputable fact I keep coming back to, circling it in my mind like a lifeline. It is as if by repeating it enough times, the words might miraculously crystallize into a universal truth, rather than just sounding like a fragile, pathetic excuse for what I allowed to unfold. It was late afternoon, one of those quintessentially quiet suburban Tuesdays, where the world feels entirely suspended in a dull, suffocatingly comfortable stillness. It was the kind of idyllic, sun-drenched day where absolutely nothing of consequence happens in neighborhoods like ours. And somehow, tragically, that is exactly when everything actually does. My husband, Richard, had just left for a business conference in Chicago that morning. He had kissed me absently on the forehead, the way you might pat a loyal dog on the head, grabbed his sleek leather carry-on, and promised he would be back in time for Sunday dinner. We had been married for 6 years. It was a comfortable arrangement, predictable, safe. I wouldn't have called us unhappy, just deeply and unremarkably settled. We were like a sturdy, aging house where you simply stop noticing the hairline fractures in the drywall because you've lived with them for so long that they just become part of the wallpaper. His son, Jackson, had moved back into his old childhood bedroom about 3 months prior. He was 22 years old, far too old to still feel like a helpless kid, yet entirely too young to resemble a man who had any functional grasp on his life. He assured his father it was only a temporary pit stop. He had abruptly dropped out of his state college sophomore year, claiming he just needed a minute to figure things out, and was currently burning hours working the front desk at a local CrossFit gym on the other side of town. I didn't pry or ask too many questions. Richard was simply relieved to have his boy safely tucked under his roof again, turning a blind eye to the aimlessness of it all. Jackson and I actually got along reasonably well. Much better than I had initially anticipated when Richard broke the news of his return. But beneath the polite surface of our daily interactions, there was always this humming electric awareness between us. It wasn't inappropriate, at least, not at first. It was just a visceral awareness of taking up space in the same room. It was the kind of unspoken frequency you never acknowledge out loud, because dragging it into the light would make the quiet mechanics of our household infinitely too complicated. He certainly wasn't a little boy anymore. That biological reality was becoming entirely impossible to ignore. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with that exasperating, careless confidence that only young guys in their early 20s seem to possess. He was perpetually wandering around the house in athletic shorts and worn-out graphic tees, his heavy over-ear headphones draped casually around his neck, leaving a faint, intoxicating slipstream of sharp cedar cologne mixed with clean laundry detergent lingering in the hallways long after he'd passed through. Despite my best efforts, I found myself noticing things I had absolutely no business noticing. I noticed the gravelly way his voice had deepened since he first left for his freshman year. I noticed the heavy calculating way he would look at me sometimes from across the living room. Eyes narrowed just a fraction, like he was trying to decipher a complex puzzle he wasn't quite sure he wanted to solve. I fiercely told myself I was just imagining the gravity of those stares. I had to believe it was all in my head. That particular Tuesday, the entire house felt chemically different the very second Richard's sedan backed out of the concrete driveway. It grew quieter, looser. It was as if some invisible, restrictive atmospheric pressure had abruptly shifted, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Jackson got off his shift and came home around 4 o'clock. I heard the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut, followed immediately by the rhythmic, heavy thumping of his sneakers taking the hardwood stairs 2 at a time. There was no hey, no polite small talk about the weather or his shift. That wasn't entirely unusual. He did that quite a bit. He often retreated straight to the sanctuary of his room, behaving as if the rest of the house, and I by extension, simply ceased to exist. I remained sequestered in the kitchen for a long while after he arrived, mindlessly rinsing coffee mugs that were already perfectly clean, and aggressively wiping down quartz countertops that didn't need polishing. I was desperate to do anything to keep my hands occupied, and my mind tethered to the mundane. I don't know exactly how long I stood there, frozen at the sink before the noise finally registered. The music was loud. It wasn't just background noise, it was absolutely blasting from his bedroom directly above the kitchen. It was some aggressive, bass, heavy hop track that actually made the ceramic tile vibrate ever so slightly under the soles of my bare feet. It felt incredibly excessive, almost violently loud, like he was actively trying to drown out his own thoughts. Or perhaps, I just desperately wanted a legitimate excuse to go upstairs and bridge the distance between us. I told myself it was purely about the noise. That I was just being a responsible homeowner asking for a reasonable volume. That is the lie I keep telling myself. I walked up the carpeted stairs agonizingly slowly, each footfall echoing louder in my own mind than it did in reality. The second-floor hallway felt suffocatingly warmer than usual. Or maybe it was just the blood rushing to my ears. His bedroom door was pushed slightly ajar. That is the one agonizing detail that refuses to leave my memory. If that door had been firmly shut, I would have knocked. I know in my bones I would have knocked. There would have been a physical barrier, a split second to pause and think. A second chance to pivot on my heel and walk safely back down to my clean kitchen. But it wasn't closed, it was just open enough. The music hit with physical force up there in the narrow hallway. The heavy bass thumping wildly against my ribcage, syncing with my escalating heartbeat. I reached the threshold without any conscious memory of how my legs had carried me there. I clearly remember lifting my right hand, knuckles curled, intending to rap on the wood just out of sheer suburban habit. And then I saw him through the gap. For a fraction of a second, my brain flat out refused to process the visual correctly. It was like staring at an optical illusion your mind rejects, because the implications are too dangerous. He was standing near the foot of his unmade bed, entirely shirtless, his broad back partially turned toward the hallway. His canvas gym bag was dumped carelessly on the rug, half unzipped. A fine sheen of sweat still clung desperately to his shoulders and spine, catching the muted, golden, her light filtering in through the blinds. He hadn't noticed me standing there in the shadows, or maybe he had, and he simply chose not to react. Time began to stretch and warp in a way I still struggle to articulate. Every passing millisecond felt like it was expanding outward, offering me more than enough grace to step backward, to clear my throat to make any kind of normal maternal noise. I didn't, I just stood there, paralyzed, drinking him in. And then, he turned around. Our eyes locked across the bedroom. That was the precise moment this entire catastrophe could have been aborted before it ever truly began. It was that agonizing split-second window where one of us could have casually tossed out something normal, something incredibly safe, something that would have forcefully shoved the dynamic back into the tidy little box where it belonged. "Hey," he said, his voice easily cutting through the heavy bass. Just, hey. He said it like absolutely nothing was out of the ordinary, like I hadn't just been caught creeping in the hallway, staring at something I absolutely had no right to look at. My throat went instantly dry, feeling like it was packed with cotton. "Your music's really loud," I managed to choke out. My own voice sounded reedy and entirely unfamiliar to my ears. He didn't make a single move toward his desk to turn it down. He didn't move at all. Actually, he just stood there, rooted to the floor, staring right back at me. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't embarrassed or surprised by the intrusion. He was just looking, and there was something dark and heavy in his expression that I had never seen before. Or perhaps, it had been there all along, and I had just been cowardly ignoring it for 3 months. "Sorry," he offered. But he didn't sound remotely apologetic. I should have turned on my heel and marched downstairs. That was the definitive exit ramp. Instead, I stepped fully inside the room. I don't even recall making the conscious choice to move my feet. It felt entirely automatic, as if my traitorous body had taken over the controls before my rational brain could hit the emergency brake. The wooden door creaked in protest as I pushed it open wider, and suddenly I was standing inside his bedroom. I was in his private space, standing dangerously close, breathing in the dense, humid air of his room. The music was still hammering away, It was too loud, everything was suddenly too much. "Can you turn it down?" I asked again, my voice dipping into a softer, shakier register. He finally broke eye contact, reaching over to snatch his phone off the tangled bedsheets. He tapped the glowing screen a few times. The overpowering volume immediately dropped, but he didn't pause the track. The heavy bass was still there, a quieter, rhythmic pulse vibrating under everything we were about to say. "Better?" he asked, looking back up through his lashes. I nodded mutely, but I didn't retreat to the hallway. That is the part of the afternoon I hate admitting out loud. There was this suffocating tension rapidly blooming between us, thick and entirely unspoken, stretching taut across the few feet of carpet separating us. I could physically feel it in the way my chest constricted, making it difficult to pull in a full breath, and in the way I couldn't quite hold his gaze for more than a fleeting second before darting my eyes away. And yet, like a moth to a flame, I kept looking back. "You didn't knock," he observed. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't framed as a question. It was simply a statement of fact. "I thought you weren't home." I lied. It was a stupid, transparent lie. He offered this agonizingly slow, slight smile. A smirk. "Really?" Almost as if he intimately knew I was lying through my teeth and found it mildly amusing. "Door was open," he countered, gesturing vaguely to the hallway. He said it like that justified the entire bizarre interaction, like that simple fact magically made my lingering okay. I should have forced out a laugh, made some lame joke about teenagers and their hearing, turned around and walked straight out. Instead, against every screaming alarm bell in my head, I said, "You should close it." Somehow, my voice sounded remarkably steadier than I actually felt. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, his eyes dragging over my face, studying me like I was a completely new variable in his environment. "Why?" he challenged softly. That single syllable hung suspended in the humid air of the bedroom for an eternity. "Why? Because I am Richard's wife. Because I am your stepmother. Because every single aspect of this energy is wrong. Because none of this is supposed to be happening under this roof." But my mouth refused to form any of those necessary saving words. "Just you should." I deflected weakly. He took a deliberate step closer. It wasn't an aggressive lunge, it was just a small shift in his weight. Just enough to effectively shrink the safe distance between us. It was enough that I was suddenly close enough to see the intimate details I had spent 90 days trying desperately not to notice. The faint, jagged little scar resting just above his left collarbone. The way his bare chest was rising and falling at a slightly faster, more elevated rhythm than normal. "Or what?" he asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly whisper. My heart began pounding against my ribs in a way that felt almost violent, a frantic, desperate thumping, as if my own body was trying to physically warn me or shock me out of my trance. "I'll start knocking," I stammered, desperately trying to sound like the adult in the room. Like I still held some semblance of authority or control over the situation. But I didn't. I wasn't even close to being in control. He let out a slow, soft breath through his nose that might have been a dark chuckle. "You can if you want." There was something terrifying about the exact way he delivered that line. It was incredibly casual, almost dismissive. He said it like the established boundaries of our family didn't matter. Like the moral lines drawn in the sand simply didn't exist unless the two of us mutually agreed they did. And as I stood there, paralyzed in the center of his room, the brutal realization washed over me. I hadn't been imagining anything. That crackling awareness humming between us for months. It had always been entirely real. We had just both been playing a massive, exhausting game of pretend. "I should go," I whispered, even though my feet felt like they were cemented to the floorboards. "Yeah," he agreed softly. But he didn't take a step back either. We just remained locked there, suspended in this bizarre, breathless bubble of time where fleeing the room felt just as physically impossible as staying in it. And then, operating entirely without logic, without forethought, without any plan at all, I did the one thing I can never ever take back. I reached out. It was a minuscule gesture, barely anything at all. My trembling hand lifted, my fingertips brushing impossibly lightly against the bare skin of his forearm. It was an instinctual, desperate movement, as if I simply needed to tactilely prove to myself that he was a solid object, that this surreal moment was actually happening in waking life. His skin was blazing hot, too warm, and he didn't flinch away. If anything, he leaned into the phantom touch, just a fraction of an inch. That was the precise catastrophic second the entire universe shifted on its axis. The point of no return wasn't when I intruded into the room. It wasn't when our eyes initially locked. It was right there the moment skin met skin. Because once that physical boundary was breached, even in the most hesitant, quietest way imaginable, the era of pretending was officially dead. There was no going back to the mundane routine. There was no more acting like this was just another boring Tuesday in a quiet, manicured suburban house. His hand was the next to move. It was agonizingly slow, deliberate. He reached up, his larger hand dwarfing mine, and gently wrapped his long fingers around my wrist. He wasn't using force, but he was effectively stopping me from pulling away. Even though, heaven help me, I hadn't even attempted to retract my arm. "Don't," he breathed softly. To this day, I don't know if he meant don't stop touching me, or don't go back to pretending. Maybe it was both. All I know for certain is that I didn't put up a fight. I didn't yank my arm out of his grasp. I didn't lecture him. I didn't say anything at all. I just stood there in the quiet storm, feeling the crushing weight of the reality pressing down on my shoulders. For the first time in an eternity, I didn't try to shove the feeling back down into the dark, and that terrified me more than anything else in my life. Because deep in my core, I knew this wasn't just an innocent accident anymore. This wasn't a slip-up. This was something we were actively mutually choosing, even if neither of us had possessed the courage to say the words out loud yet. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I truly tried. I lay stiff as a board in the master bedroom, resting in the expansive empty space where Richard should have been snoring softly. I stared unblinkingly up at the dark ceiling, silently begging the plaster to offer me some kind of profound answer. I prayed for the universe to inexplicably rewind time just a few hours so I could make a different choice in that hallway. But every time I squeezed my eyes shut, my nervous system betrayed me. I felt the exact sensation of it all over again. The radiating warmth of Jackson's skin beneath my fingertips, the heavy weight of his gaze, the way he didn't pull away in horror, the way I had willingly stayed. The memory played on a relentless, tormenting loop that I couldn't shatter. It wasn't even the visual of the moment that kept me awake. It was the emotional shift. It felt like a sealed vault inside my chest had violently cracked open, and I had absolutely no idea how to force the heavy doors shut again. I kept whispering to myself in the dark that it meant nothing. It was just a weird, emotionally charged misstep, a temporary lapse in judgment triggered by loneliness or boredom. It was an anomaly that would naturally fade into oblivion if I just ignored it aggressively enough. That was the desperate narrative I spun for myself, but my body violently rejected the lie. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind rattling the window panes, had me instantly on high alert. Every time I hallucinated the sound of footsteps in the downstairs hallway, my chest seized up in pure panic, feeling exactly like a criminal about to be caught red-handed. And I was completely alone in my locked bedroom, doing absolutely nothing but breathing. Sometime around 2 a.m, the oppressive silence of the bedroom became unbearable. I surrendered the fight for sleep, threw off the heavy duvet, and shoved my arms into an oversized college hoodie. I padded softly downstairs to the expansive kitchen, seeking the comfort of cold tile. The entire house was bathed in heavy shadows, completely still and silent. I poured myself a tall glass of ice water from the fridge dispenser and leaned against the counter, staring blankly out the window into the pitch black backyard. I tried desperately to focus my racing mind on something normal: grocery lists, the upcoming water bill, something grounding. It was a spectacular failure, because the only coherent thought circling my brain was whether he was awake up there, and why on earth his sleep schedule even mattered to me. I promised myself, making a silent vow to the empty kitchen, that I would never go anywhere near his bedroom ever again. Not tomorrow, not ever. That was it. One monumental lapse in judgment done. Buried. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the freezing water, my eyes tracing the silhouette of the oak tree in the yard, when I heard the unmistakable sound footsteps. They were muffled by the carpet but heavy and deliberate. They were coming from right behind me. My spine locked. I didn't dare turn around right away. I physically couldn't. For one fleeting, desperate second, I bargained with myself. If I don't turn around, maybe it is just the house settling. Maybe it is nothing. Maybe I am just losing my mind. But then the air shifted in the room. I felt that suffocating, magnetic pull again, the undeniable weight of his presence. "You always up this late?" Jackson's voice floated through the dark kitchen, coming from just a few feet behind me. His tone was incredibly low, smooth, completely calm. He sounded as if the earth-shattering moment upstairs had never happened. I turned around agonizingly slowly. He was leaning casually against the doorframe of the kitchen entrance. He was wearing nothing but a pair of faded gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. His dark hair was chaotic, sticking up in different directions, clearly indicating he had been tossing and turning in bed but couldn't find sleep either. For a long, dangerous second, we simply stared at each other across the island counter. It was exactly the same heavy silence as before. Except now, the context had violently shifted. He was no longer just the moody 22-year-old stepson I shared an address with. He was something else entirely, and I despised how sharply my body recognized that fact. "Couldn't sleep," I murmured, working hard to keep my voice flat and completely neutral. He offered a slow nod, as if my insomnia made perfect, logical sense to him. "Yeah, me neither." "Of course not." A suffocating silence crashed down and settled heavily over the kitchen. But it wasn't an empty quiet. It was dense, practically vibrating with all the dangerous things we had left unsaid a few hours prior. Unable to handle the intensity of his stare, I turned my back to him, facing the sink again, pretending to obsessively rinse my water glass just to give my shaking hands a task. "You do that a lot," he noted, his voice suddenly closer. He had moved away from the doorframe. "Do what?" I asked, my voice wavering. "Pretend nothing's going on." My hands instantly froze under the stream of cold water. I reached out and shut the faucet off with a sharp twist, setting the dripping glass down on the counter. I took a deep, shuddering breath before forcing myself to turn back around and face him. "I don't know what you are talking about." I lied again, even to my own ears. The denial sounded pathetic, rehearsed and hopelessly weak. He didn't bother arguing. He just stepped further into the kitchen, easily closing the physical distance between us until he was standing on the opposite side of the marble island. "Yeah, you do." There was zero teasing in his voice, no humor, just a terrifying, unwavering certainty. "You came into my room," he continued, his dark eyes locking onto mine and refusing to let go. "And you didn't leave." My pulse skyrocketed, that same overwhelming, intoxicating rush flooding my veins. "I told you exactly why I came in there," I snapped back, trying to summon some righteous indignation. "For the music?" he challenged, one dark eyebrow arching in clear disbelief. I clamped my mouth shut. I didn't answer because we both knew that was a pathetic excuse, and neither of us had the energy to entertain the lie anymore. "Then why didn't you leave?" he pressed, his voice dropping an octave. The question struck me like a physical blow to the chest, because I didn't have an answer that I could safely speak aloud. I defensively crossed my arms over the front of my oversized hoodie, a purely instinctual move designed to build a physical barricade between us. "It was a terrible mistake," I finally said, practically spitting the words out. There it was, the definitive boundary line. The harsh declaration that was supposed to act like cold water, shutting down the entire escalating situation and ending it for good. He stood there and studied my face for a long, quiet moment, his eyes scanning my features as if he were actively deciding whether he bought my performance or not. "And touching me?" he asked quietly, the question barely louder than a whisper. My breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. "That was a mistake too," he added relentlessly. I felt a fiery heat erupt along the back of my neck, a deep flush rushing up my face and burning my cheeks in a way that made it completely impossible to pretend I was immune to him. "Yes," I blurted out. Much too quickly, he didn't blink. He simply walked around the edge of the kitchen island, invading my side of the room. Now he was standing directly in front of me, so imposing and close that I was forced to tilt my chin up slightly just to maintain eye contact. "I don't think it was," he countered smoothly. There was something unnervingly steady about his demeanor. He was entirely controlled, utterly lacking any of the confusion or panic that was currently shredding my insides. It was as if he had already mentally mapped out this entire scenario, solved the equation, and recognized that I was the only pathetic one left in the room, still trying to pretend the math didn't add up. "You are wrong," I fired back. But my voice trembled, entirely devoid of any real conviction. "Then look me in the eye and say it again," he dared me softly. I hesitated. It was just for a fraction of a second. But that micro-hesitation was all the ammunition he needed. He saw the crack in my armor immediately. "You can't even do it," he murmured, a hint of dark triumph edging into his tone. "I can," I shot back fiercely, forcing my eyes wide open to hold his intense gaze. "It was a mistake." He didn't flinch. He didn't back away or react with the rejection I had anticipated. He just stood there, looking down at me, and then, very slowly, he lifted his right hand. Every single muscle in my body seized up in anticipation. His hand hovered in the air, stopping just an inch shy of my face, lingering there as if he was intentionally giving me a massive window of opportunity to step backward and end it. I didn't move a muscle. I knew I should have practically sprinted out of the kitchen, but I remained frozen in place. His long fingers finally closed the gap, brushing incredibly lightly against the sensitive skin along my jawline. The touch was feather, light barely there, as if he was running a high-stakes experiment, testing my boundaries to see when I would finally snap and push him away. "This feels like a mistake to you?" he asked, his voice rough and incredibly soft. My heart was thrashing so violently against my ribs I swear I could feel the pulse hammering in the back of my throat. I couldn't form a single rational thought. Every alarm bell in my brain had been completely short-circuited. The only thing I could register was that the air was too thick, the kitchen was too quiet, and he was too close, too warm, too painfully real. "Yes," I lied in a desperate whisper. But the word was utterly betrayed by my body. I didn't take a step back. I didn't bat his hand away. I didn't break the electric contact, and my paralysis was all the answer he needed. His thumb shifted, dragging lightly along the curve of my cheekbone in a slow, agonizingly deliberate motion, as if he were trying to permanently memorize the exact way my skin flushed under his touch. I let my eyes flutter shut, just for one fleeting second to endure the intensity of it, and that surrender was all it took. Because when I forced my eyes open a moment later, whatever fragile illusion of control I thought I was clinging to had completely evaporated into thin air. "This shouldn't be happening," I breathed. But the words felt hollow and entirely disconnected from reality, like they were being spoken by a stranger on a television screen across the room. "I know," he agreed without hesitation, but his hand never stopped stroking my cheek. And I didn't step away. There was this massive, heavy pause, a final, towering precipice, where everything in my entire life hung precariously in the balance. It was the absolute last exit. The final moment where I could have physically shoved him back, walked out of the kitchen, marched upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and awoken the next morning as the faithful, upstanding suburban wife I had always believed myself to be. Instead of walking away, I leaned forward. It wasn't a sudden, frantic grab. It wasn't the chaotic, explosive collision you see in the movies. It was agonizingly slow, careful. I moved toward him hesitantly, almost as if I was intentionally giving myself plenty of time to come to my senses and abort the mission. I didn't. When our lips finally met, it was shockingly quiet. It felt too quiet. Honestly, it felt like something heavy and dark that had been secretly building pressure behind a dam for months had finally found a tiny fissure to escape through. And the absolute worst, most terrifying part of it all. In that exact second, it didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel like a violation. It felt horrifyingly inevitable. That realization struck terror into my very core, because it confirmed that this was no longer a misunderstanding or an isolated accident. This wasn't something I could nervously laugh off in the morning or attribute to wine and insomnia. This was a real, tangible choice, and we were both stepping over the edge together with our eyes wide open. His large hand slid smoothly from my jaw around to the nape of my neck, his fingers tangling in my messy hair. He pulled me flush against his chest, not forcefully, but with just enough firm pressure to deepen the kiss. And I surrendered to it completely. I didn't think about Richard sleeping in a hotel in Chicago. I didn't think about the catastrophic fallout or the moral bankruptcy of my actions. I didn't think about anything at all, except the overwhelming sensation that everything inside my chest was unraveling and knitting itself back together simultaneously. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air in the dark kitchen, it certainly wasn't because either of us wanted to stop. It was sheer biological necessity. We stood there, chests heaving, inches apart, staring at each other wildly as the adrenaline crashed through our systems, desperately trying to process the magnitude of the line we had just obliterated. "You are going to regret this," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking uncontrollably. Even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure if I was issuing a warning to him or desperately trying to convince myself. "Maybe," he replied breathlessly. But the dark, intense look in his eyes told me he didn't believe a word of it. I didn't believe it either, and standing there in the cold kitchen staring up at my husband's son, I came to a realization that was infinitely more damning than the physical betrayal itself. I didn't want to regret it. That horrifying truth terrified me more than the prospect of getting caught, because wanting it meant that I was an active, willing participant. Choosing to lean into that kiss meant that there were no external circumstances I could blame. I couldn't blame his youth. I couldn't blame a misunderstanding. I couldn't blame bad timing. There was only me, and the dark, suppressed desires I had finally let off the leash. And as I stared at Jackson in the dark, a sickening feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I knew with absolute certainty that this kiss was only the beginning of the end. Waking up the next morning didn't carry the refreshing promise of a new day. It felt like dragging myself back into the continuation of a nightmare that never should have been authorized to begin. I startled awake 20 minutes before my alarm was set to go off, my entire body rigid and coiled tight, as if I had spent the last 6 hours bracing for a physical impact. For a few agonizing minutes, I just lay there frozen under the sheets, staring blankly at the beige ceiling. I was trapped in that hazy, disorienting purgatory between deep sleep and full consciousness, where your mistakes haven't quite regained their crushing physical weight yet. Then, like a dam bursting, the memories flooded the valley, the cold kitchen floor. His low voice, the heat of his hand on my neck, the terrifying way I had leaned into him instead of pulling away. I slowly turned my head on the pillow, looking at Richard's side of the king mattress. It was perfectly empty. The expensive cotton sheets were completely smooth, untouched and cold. Exactly the way they had been when he left for the airport the day before. There was something deeply sickening about that visual. Seeing how perfectly normal and undisturbed the bedroom looked made my stomach churn violently. It felt as though I had sleepwalked into a completely different, darker parallel universe overnight. And the inanimate objects in my house simply hadn't received the memo that my old life was officially dead. I sat up at a glacial pace, digging the heels of my hands into my tired eyes, frantically trying to assemble some kind of mental scaffolding to keep myself from collapsing. This had to stop immediately. That was the very first crystal-clear directive my brain managed to formulate. Whatever the hell this twisted dynamic was. Whatever line I had disastrously allowed us to cross in the dark. It absolutely could not go a single inch further. It was already catastrophic. I had already crossed moral boundaries that could never be uncrossed. But I could at least stop the bleeding. I aggressively lectured myself as I threw off the covers. I would simply avoid him. It was a large house, it was a simple plan. I would stay endlessly busy. I would leave the property from dawn until dusk if that is what it took. I would build a fortress of ice around myself and keep everything strictly distant, rigidly controlled, and violently normal. I rehearsed this emergency protocol over and over in my head as I walked to the bathroom, clutching onto the rules like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. But even as I turned on the hot water in the shower, I knew exactly how pathetic and fragile that plan was, because a terrifyingly loud part of my brain didn't actually want to avoid him at all. I forced myself through the motions of my morning routine with militant precision: shower, blowout, makeup. I wanted to look completely unbothered, like I was firmly back in control of my reality. I selected my clothes with absurd care, a modest beige cashmere sweater and tailored jeans, something utterly boring and matronly. Nothing that could possibly be misconstrued as an invitation. By the time I finally descended the staircase, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs, I thought maybe the universe would cut me a break. Maybe he had an early shift at the gym, maybe the house would be empty, and I wouldn't have to face the immediate consequences of my actions. But my luck had clearly run out. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen, he was right there. He was sitting casually on one of the leather bar stools at the center island, intensely scrolling through his phone. A steaming mug of black coffee rested on the granite in front of him. He looked entirely relaxed, as if this was just another beautifully mundane Wednesday morning, and we hadn't fundamentally destroyed our family tree 12 hours prior. He glanced up when my heels clicked against the tile, and the air immediately evaporated from the room. There it was again, that heavy knowing look, that quiet, profound understanding that zipped between us in a fraction of a second, communicating everything without requiring a single spoken word. "Morning," he said. His tone was infuriatingly casual, easy, completely devoid of guilt or panic. It was the tone of a man who slept incredibly well. "Morning," I parroted back, fighting a desperate battle to keep my voice from shaking as I marched stiffly toward the espresso machine. Every single footstep felt heavily calculated, every gesture wildly exaggerated. Don't look at him, don't engage, be a robot. I grabbed a mug from the cabinet and poured my coffee, intensely focusing all my mental energy on the dark liquid filling the cup. I focused on the comforting heat radiating through the ceramic against my cold palms. I needed anything to anchor me to reality so I wouldn't have to turn around and look at his face. It was a futile effort. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could physically feel the weight of his eyes burning into my back. "You sleep?" he asked conversationally. "Not really," I answered tightly. "Yeah," he murmured, taking a slow sip from his mug. "Same, of course." The kitchen plunged back into a suffocating heavy silence, but he wasn't finished. "You okay?" he asked softly. That particular question derailed my train of thought entirely. It sounded far too gentle, far too genuine, and it sparked a flare of hot panic in my chest, because I absolutely did not want him to care about my emotional state. "I am perfectly fine," I snapped, turning around defensively. "Listen, Jackson, we shouldn't." I bit my tongue hard, instantly regretting opening my mouth. It was too late to put the pin back in the grenade. His dark eyes snapped up to meet mine, his expression shifting into something far more dangerous and alert. He looked like a predator that had just spotted a weakness in the fence. "Shouldn't what?" he challenged, his voice dropping slightly. I gripped my coffee mug so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white, forcing myself to maintain eye contact rather than backing down. "This," I said, my voice barely above a harsh whisper. "Whatever happened last night. Whatever this is." He leaned back slowly against the backrest of the bar stool, folding his muscular arms across his chest as he evaluated my panic. "You mean when we kissed," he stated bluntly. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking. "Yes." He let the silence stretch out, forcing me to sit in the discomfort of his bluntness. "It happened," he said simply. He offered zero hesitation, zero apologies. No frantic attempts to rewrite history and claim it was an accident. It happened. Like gravity, like the weather. It was just an undeniable fact of the universe now. "That doesn't mean it has to keep happening," I fired back, my voice gaining a desperate edge. There it was. I was finally drawing the hard line in the sand. The boundary I should have fiercely protected from the very beginning. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he uncrossed his arms and stood up from the stool. He moved with a terrifying grace, and suddenly, he wasn't safely separated from me by the width of the island anymore. He had walked around the counter and was standing directly in my personal space again. Close enough that I could smell the sharp, clean scent of his body wash. The exact same suffocating tension from the night before came rushing back into the room, threatening to drown me. "You really sure about that?" he asked, looking down at me. My traitorous heart instantly betrayed me, accelerating into a frantic, chaotic rhythm that made it entirely impossible to think logically. "Yes," I insisted. But the word was incredibly hollow, lacking any shred of real authority. "Because it sure doesn't feel like that," he observed, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that sent a shiver down my spine. "It feels a lot more like you are just desperately trying to convince yourself." I shook my head sharply, breaking eye contact. I know exactly what this is." "Then say it out loud," he demanded softly. I hesitated. I froze again. That damned hesitation was rapidly becoming a toxic pattern I couldn't seem to break out of, no matter how hard I tried. "It is a mistake," I finally whispered, staring fiercely at the granite countertop. He stood perfectly still, watching me for a long, torturous minute. Finally, he gave a single slow nod, as if he were cataloging my lie for future reference. "Okay," he said calmly. A massive wave of relief crashed over me, loosening the tight coil in my chest. He was backing down, but the relief was violently short-lived, because instead of stepping back and giving me room to breathe, he leaned forward. He reached right past my shoulder to grab his abandoned coffee mug from the counter behind me. In doing so, his bare forearm dragged heavily and deliberately against my own arm. That brief, entirely intentional physical contact sent a jagged bolt of electricity straight up my arm. I gasped softly, completely caught off guard by the intensity of the spark, and he knew exactly what he was doing. I saw the dark flash of satisfaction in his eyes as he pulled back. "You keep saying the words," he murmured quietly, taking a slow sip of his coffee while watching my flushed face, "but your body really doesn't seem to agree with your script." A furious rush of heat flooded my veins, a chaotic cocktail of deep frustration, intense embarrassment, and a dark, terrifying desire that I violently refused to acknowledge. "That doesn't mean anything," I snapped defensively. "It means everything," he corrected simply. I opened my mouth to verbally tear him apart to put him in his place, but absolutely nothing came out. My vocal cords failed me because, deep down in the darkest, most terrifying corner of my soul, I knew he was absolutely right. And that paralyzing realization made everything 1,000 times worse. "I am deadly serious," I warned, forcing every ounce of fake authority I could muster into my tone. "This completely ends right here. Today." He watched my chest heave for a second, his expression completely unreadable. Then, he placed his empty mug in the sink. "All right," he conceded. Just like that, no aggressive pushback, no demanding arguments. He just accepted the terms. It should have felt like a massive victory. It should have made me feel safe. It didn't, because there was something entirely condescending about the way he agreed. He sounded like he was simply humoring a hysterical woman. He was giving me a temporary pass, allowing me to cling to my little delusions for the time being. "I've got a long shift," he added casually, scooping his car keys off the kitchen counter. "Good," I shot back, the word leaving my mouth entirely too fast. He smirked, a dark, knowing curve of his lips indicating he had caught my panic perfectly. "Relax," he mocked gently. "I am not going to jump you in the middle of the kitchen." "That is not what I meant," I growled, my cheeks burning with fresh humiliation, but my shaky voice completely ruined the defense. "Sure," he laughed lightly, turning his back on me. He walked confidently toward the front door. Just as his hand hit the doorknob, he paused. He didn't turn around to look at me, but his voice echoed clearly down the hallway. "We'll see exactly how long this ends right here phase lasts." Then the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The house immediately plunged back into silence. But it wasn't the peaceful, boring quiet of a suburban Wednesday anymore. It felt incredibly hostile. It felt as though the suffocating silence was actively waiting in anticipation. A massive, destructive boulder had been forcefully pushed over the edge of the cliff the night before, and I was standing alone in the kitchen, foolishly pretending I could hold up my hands and stop the landslide. I remained rooted to the kitchen floor for a very long time after the roar of his car engine faded down the street. I stared blankly at the stainless steel appliances, obsessively replaying every single syllable, every dark look, every agonizing microsecond of the confrontation. I meant what I said. I had to mean it. This nightmare could not progress any further. I would simply lock it down. I just needed to summon my willpower, stay focused on my marriage, and stay the hell away from him. It was a flawless, logical plan. But beneath all my furious rationalizing, a dark, nagging truth clawed at my insides, refusing to be silenced. The honest, brutal reality was that the most difficult part of this entire ordeal wasn't going to be avoiding Jackson. The hardest part was going to be fighting a vicious, bloody war against the feral part of my own psyche that desperately wanted him to come back. And as I stared at my shaking hands, I began to fully realize that the dark part of me was vastly stronger than I had ever feared. The remainder of that Wednesday dragged by at an agonizing, torturous crawl. It felt as if time itself was intentionally slowing down, mocking my frantic desire for the day to end. I desperately tried to adhere to my hastily constructed plan. I fled the house by noon. I drove aimlessly around the neighboring suburbs for an hour, wasting expensive gas, before eventually wandering into a massive, brightly lit grocery store on the other side of town. A store I absolutely did not need to visit. I pushed a squeaky metal cart slowly up and down the sprawling aisles, my eyes glossing over brightly colored cereal boxes and canned soups without actually registering any of the labels. I systematically tossed random, unnecessary items into the basket: expensive olive oils, artisanal crackers, a terrifyingly large bag of organic apples, just to simulate the motions of normalcy. I needed to feel like I was still a fully functional, boring adult woman who genuinely cared about meal prepping and organizing a pantry. And not a woman whose entire moral compass had spontaneously combusted over the span of 24 hours. But none of the retail therapy worked. Not even a little bit. No matter how aggressively I focused on the nutritional facts on a box of pasta, my mind relentlessly, violently snapped back to him. My thoughts obsessively circled back to the dark, confident way he had looked at me that morning. I kept hearing his parting words echoing over the grocery store muzak. "We'll see how long this lasts." He hadn't said it with an arrogant sneer. He hadn't been playfully teasing me. He had stated it as a cold, hard, inevitable fact, and it was that terrifying, quiet certainty that burrowed deep under my skin and refused to let go. By the time I finally surrendered and drove back to my own neighborhood, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns and splashing a soft, golden glow across the siding of the houses. I put the car in park in my driveway, but I didn't immediately kill the engine. I sat behind the leather steering wheel for a long, silent minute, gripping the wheel so tightly my hands cramped, taking deep, shuddering breaths. This was my sanctuary. This was the house I had painstakingly decorated with Richard. I shouldn't be sitting in my own driveway feeling like a soldier preparing to walk through a psychological minefield. But I was terrified of my own front door. I finally killed the engine, hoisted the heavy paper grocery bags into my arms, and let myself into the house. I dumped the bags onto the kitchen island with a heavy sigh. The house was entirely silent, exactly as I had left it, for a fleeting, wonderful second. I allowed myself to believe Jackson was still pulling a double shift at the gym. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over my tense shoulders. Then, I heard the unmistakable rumble of water pipes directly above my head. The shower was running in the upstairs guest bathroom, and just like that, the brief moment of peace shattered, and every single nerve ending in my body ignited and pulled taut. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a slow, shaky breath through my nose. Ignore it. Stay downstairs. Do not move from this kitchen. Stick to the goddamn plan. I began aggressively unpacking the groceries, slamming cans of soup into the pantry, focusing fiercely on the mindless, repetitive task. I organized the spices I had bought by alphabetical order, anything to keep my hands moving, and my spiraling thoughts grounded in the present reality. But the distraction didn't hold. The rushing sound of the shower upstairs refused to fade into the background white noise. It seemed to grow exponentially louder in the quiet house, echoing down the air vents and taunting me. Or more accurately, my ears were fixated, straining to listen to it. Either way, I was completely incapable of ignoring the fact that he was naked, wet, and directly above me. I hated myself for it. I violently shoved the last box of cereal into the cabinet, roughly wiped my damp hands on a cotton dish towel, and just stood frozen in the center of the kitchen. I was trapped in a fierce, exhausting silent argument with my own fractured psyche. Do not go up those stairs, that is the only rule you have to follow. Just stay here. For a few agonizing minutes, I genuinely naively believed I possessed the willpower to obey my own command. Until my feet started moving, to this day. I cannot recall making the conscious choice to abandon the kitchen. 1 second I was gripping the edge of the granite counter, knuckles white, and the very next second I was halfway up the carpeted staircase. My heart already hammering against my ribs, like a caged bird that knew exactly what disaster was waiting on the second floor. The rushing sound of the water was crystal clear now, echoing humidly down the upstairs hallway. I commanded my feet to stop when I was 3 steps away from his bedroom door. It was firmly closed this time. That slab of painted wood should have been exactly the physical barrier I needed. It should have been the definitive stop sign that sent me packing back downstairs. But it wasn't, because last night had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Now, I knew exactly what kind of heat and danger existed on the other side of that wood. And the twisted, corrupted knowledge of it pulled at me with a gravitational force I was entirely unequipped to fight. I stood paralyzed in the quiet hallway for what felt like an eternity. I stared blankly at the brass doorknob, my rational mind screaming bloody murder, begging me to spin around, march away, and stop this madness before I crossed a line so severe that I could never ever look Richard in the eye again. But my right hand betrayed me. It lifted of its own accord, and this time, I actually knocked. It was a soft, rapid, cowardly little knock, executed as if I were desperately trying to trick the universe into believing I wasn't fully committing to the intrusion. The rushing water behind the door was violently shut off almost immediately. A dense, heavy silence swallowed the hallway. Then, his voice slightly muffled by the door and the steam drifted out. "Yeah?" I swallowed a hard lump of panic, suddenly hyper, aware of how insanely predatory this looked, how incredibly wrong this felt, and how I possessed absolutely zero justifiable excuses for standing outside his bathroom while he was showering. I just need to grab some clean towels from the hall closet," I stammered. The pathetic lie tumbled out of my mouth in a rushed, uneven, entirely unconvincing breath. There was a long, agonizing pause from the other side of the door. It was a silence so thick and pregnant that I instantly knew he was standing dripping wet on the bath mat, smirking at my terrible excuse. Doors unlocked. He finally called out. Of course it was. My trembling hand wrapped around the cool brass knob before my rational brain could scream one final warning. I pushed the door inward. A thick cloud of dense warm steam immediately rolled out into the cooler hallway, engulfing me. The entire room smelled heavily of sharp Irish Spring soap and that faint intoxicating cedar scent that was uniquely his. The inner door connecting his bedroom to the ensuite bathroom was pushed halfway open, bright fluorescent light spilling aggressively out onto his carpet. I could clearly hear the wet sounds of him moving around on the tile floor inside. You know, you could have just grabbed the towels from the hall closet without actually coming into my room. He called out from the bathroom, his deep voice echoing clearly off the tile. I didn't want to just barge in while you were dressing, I called back defensively. Although the claim was so ridiculously hypocritical, I almost choked on it. A sharp, amused exhale of breath, a distinct laugh, bounced out from the bathroom. Right. I stepped completely into the bedroom, letting the heavy door click shut behind me without really processing the finality of the action. The metallic click of the latch engaging sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I forced my stiff legs to walk toward his open closet, aggressively ripping two fluffy white towels from the high shelf, desperately trying to construct a realistic alibi out of thin air. But once the towels were firmly in my hands, I didn't turn around and leave. I remained glued to the floor, standing right in the center of his messy bedroom, the exact same spot where this entire nightmare had ignited less than 24 hours ago. The bathroom door creaked loudly on its hinges, and then he stepped out into the bedroom. A single damp white towel was slung impossibly low around his waist, clinging to his hips. Droplets of water were still clinging to the dark wet hair plastered to his forehead, slowly sliding down the sharp column of his neck, and tracing slow, agonizing paths across the hard planes of his chest. It was a visual that demanded to be stared at, and I should have immediately averted my eyes like a decent human being. I didn't look away for a single second. We just stood there, completely frozen, facing each other across the room. The humid air between us felt incredibly thick, practically suffocating with the sheer volume of all the dangerous things we were actively ignoring. You got your towels, he noted. It wasn't a question at all. I blinked stupidly, glancing down at the folded white cotton in my shaking hands, almost as if I had suffered amnesia and genuinely forgotten why I was clutching them like a lifeline. Yeah, but my feet remained planted. Again, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. He wasn't shocked by my audacity. He wasn't confused by my lingering. He was just intensely, darkly aware of exactly what was happening. You are not leaving, he said softly. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It was a simple, clinical observation of my failure to retreat. I felt my knuckles turn white as I squeezed the towels tighter. I really should, I breathed. But I didn't budge. His dark, calculating gaze locked onto mine, holding me entirely captive in the silence. Then why aren't you? He challenged smoothly. There it was. The ultimate damning question that I was completely incapable of answering without confessing to a truth that would destroy my life. I honestly don't know, I whispered, and offering that raw, pathetic honesty felt infinitely more reckless and dangerous than spitting out another lie. Because it was the truth, I was lost. He took a deliberate, slow step toward me. It was a measured, careful movement, offering me a massive glowing neon exit sign if I wanted to run. I didn't run. The physical space between us rapidly evaporated, mirroring the exact terrifying choreography from the kitchen the night before. Only this time, standing in his humid bedroom, the atmosphere felt exponentially heavier. It felt deeply intentional. We were no longer stumbling in the dark. We were walking into the fire with our eyes open. You keep loudly insisting this is a massive mistake, he murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble in his chest. But you keep miraculously showing up wherever I am. My pulse hammered violently against my throat, keeping time with his words. I am really trying to stop, I pleaded weakly. Are you? He asked quietly. I hesitated. A long, agonizing pause, and that pathetic silence answered every question he ever had. He slowly lifted his hands. His long fingers brushed incredibly lightly against the soft terry cloth in my grasp, before his warm hands smoothly slid directly over my cold, shaking knuckles. He didn't forcefully rip the towels away. He just applied a gentle, steady pressure, slowly prying my fingers open, loosening my death grip until the folded towels simply slipped freely from my hands. They plummeted to the carpet without either of us breaking eye contact to watch them fall. The soft, muffled thud of the fabric hitting the floor felt incredibly final. It was the sound of a judge's gavel coming down. A devastating ruling had just been made in the quiet room. You really don't look like a woman who is trying to stop, he whispered, stepping fully into my personal space. I am, I breathed, my voice cracking entirely, unsure if I even believed the lie myself anymore. His large, damp hand slid smoothly from my empty hands, wrapping firmly around the curve of my waist. His touch was light at first, lingering on the fabric of my sweater, seemingly offering me one absolute final chance to push him away and salvage my marriage. I didn't push him, and the very second his fingers flexed, his grip tightening just a fraction of an inch to pull my body flush against his. I yielded completely. I let him take control. There was absolutely no more space for pretending after that physical surrender. There were no more pathetic, weak attempts to draw imaginary moral boundaries that we both knew damn well we had zero intention of respecting. Because this time, when he ducked his head and leaned in, I didn't freeze in shock. I didn't hesitate. I rose up on my toes and met him aggressively halfway. The explosive collision of our mouths confirmed that a tectonic plate inside my soul had permanently shifted. This was no longer a stolen, confused kiss in a dark kitchen. This wasn't an accidental brush of lips. This was a ferocious, intentional choice made in broad daylight, fully aware of the catastrophic damage it was going to inflict. His damp arms wrapped completely around me, his hands sliding hungrily up my back, pulling me impossibly closer against his wet chest. And the terrifying mind-bending reality was that I responded to him with a feral desperation that absolutely horrified me. It didn't scare me because the sensation was entirely foreign. It terrified me because it felt so incredibly, disgustingly natural. It felt as if this dark, reckless, destructive version of myself had been lying dormant beneath the surface for my entire suburban life, just patiently waiting for the right catalyst to violently claw its way out. When we finally broke apart this time, gasping for air in the humid room, it wasn't because the passion had naturally subsided. It was because a noise shattered the house. It was a sharp, sudden, metallic sound that pierced through the walls. The unmistakable, heavy clatter of the front door deadbolt unlocking downstairs. We both froze instantly, turning into stone statues. Every single muscle, tendon, and nerve ending in my entire body locked up in sheer, paralyzing terror. My stomach violently bottomed out, dropping so fast and so hard it genuinely felt like I was physically falling through the floorboards. That is, I choked out, but my vocal cords completely seized, trapping the name in my throat. Jackson's entire demeanor violently shifted for the very first time since this nightmare began. The arrogant calmness vanished instantly. He wasn't controlled anymore. He was wildly alert, his dark eyes blown wide. Did you? He started, his voice a frantic hiss. No. I rasped desperately. You specifically said you were working the late shift today. A massive echoing sound ripped through the quiet house. Footsteps on the hardwood floor in the foyer. Real heavy, adult footsteps, moving with purpose, and then a voice boomed out from the bottom of the staircase. Hey, anyone home? Richard, the blood in my veins turned entirely to ice. The world tilted violently on its axis. He wasn't supposed to be within 500 miles of this house. The Chicago conference wasn't over until Sunday. It was impossible. And yet, the booming familiar timbre of my husband's voice carried clearly through the drywall, sounding like a grim reaper arriving to collect a debt. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic hit me so fast and so violently. It felt like a physical blow to the head. It completely decimated every single rational, logical thought I possessed. Jackson scrambled backward as if he had just been electrocuted, his hands ripping away from my waist in sheer terror. "Shit!" he cursed viciously under his breath, his eyes darting frantically around the room. My brain violently short-circuited, scrambling and failing to catch up to the disaster, frantically trying to calculate how this impossible timeline was happening. What the hell I was supposed to do, and how to magically fix a catastrophic mistake that was fundamentally unfixable. "Why the hell is he here?" Jackson demanded in a harsh, urgent whisper, his chest heaving with panic. "I don't know," I cried silently, my chest constricting so tightly I couldn't draw a full breath. Another heavy set of footsteps echoed loudly from the hallway below. He was moving closer. He was heading directly toward the bottom of the stairs. "Hello?" Richard's voice called out again, louder this time, echoing up the stairwell. And standing there frozen in the center of Jackson's humid bedroom, the door closed behind me, the air still impossibly thick with the heat of everything we had just done, a horrifying, inescapable clarity washed over me. There was absolutely no version of this reality where we survived the next 5 minutes. There was no excuse, no lie, no alternate timeline where we were not walking out of this room completely destroyed.